Hello, my name is Dr. Susan Robbins, and the class you are watching is Comparative Human Behavior Theory. Hello, class.
Hello. Hi.
Use your mics. Say hello to all the future viewing audiences.
Hello. Okay.
Hello. Thank you. Okay, last week we talked about systems theory and systems theories because there are several systems theories. This week we're going to shift a little bit, but before we shift, we'll talk about an opposite set of theories that has some opposite assumptions. Before we shift, though, I want to just clarify some of the things that I was doing here last week with the tablet. So if you could go to the tablet, Phil, please. If you remember last week, one of the things that we were doing was diagramming systems. And in the session we had after the tape portion, we also diagrammed systems. I just wanted to clarify something because I was just drawing circles everywhere, right? I'm going to give you a better example about what a systems diagram should look like. Let's say hypothetically that that's the individual who is your focal system, right? So that's the individual. That individual it has smaller subsystems to him and her. Remember that? Say yes, everybody.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yes. And we said, for example, and again, this is not exhaustive, but it's simply examples. That person has, for example, spiritual systems, perhaps other belief systems, biological systems, neurological systems within the biological systems, et cetera, et cetera. So that person is made up of a group of subsystems that are internal. External to that person, and here's where the diagram that you were working with last week was a little bit off, because we were just calling out systems and I was drawing circles everywhere, right? Well, instead of that, this person is part of a family system, right? And that family system, and how do we indicate however we want to make this darker to show that that is our primary system? We could use a different color to show that that's the focal system. That person is part of a bigger system, which is the super system. Remember that? And in that family, we have that individual. We have a mom. We could have a dad. We could have some sisters and brothers. And that's external or a super system to that person. That make sense so far? Okay, now that family does not live in isolation. That family lives within the context of, go back to the back, a community, of which they are one of many families. So there are other families in this community. What else do we have in communities? You have to hit the microphone.
Schools, churches.
Schools. We have schools. We have churches. We have retail stores. We have businesses, other businesses, et cetera, y'all following that? And those are external. And remember, this is our focal system right here. And that's how we know it's the focal system, because we demarcate it with a different color or a different line. So let me go back and make the rest of the family. We have the mother, we have the father, we have a sister, we have a brother. And if that person has cousins, if that individual has cousins, they're over here in these other families that are interconnected. You're following that? Okay, and then at the next level up, this community exists in what? A state, right? And since we're in Texas, we'll just call this the state of Texas, even though that's not the way it looks on the map. Okay, and in Texas, in the state of Texas, what do we have? We have other communities, right? We have other cities, other communities. We have, what else? We have Texas legislature. What else do we have in Texas? We have DOT, Texas Department of Transportation. You're following this? That we have other systems that are subsystems within the larger systems, but supra or external to the environment, to the individual. So that if you go up another systems level, we have the state of Texas and then we have the United States. And some of the super systems there are
the executive.
You have to use the mic.
The government.
Okay, government. So you said the executive branch. What else?
Courts.
We have federal courts. Anybody else? What else do we have? We have a legislature, don't we? So what I'm trying to get at is that we have many other super systems, and this is the more proper way to draw it, because I was just drawing circles here and there and everywhere. But this way you can actually show the interconnectedness between, for example, schools, and let's say sometimes we have governmental bodies out here in the United States at the federal level that will make policies that affect the schools at the local level. And you'll be showing that with arrows that go back and forth in both directions. Any questions about that? Yeah. Marina.
Could you please explain again, remind me why the ones that are the brothers and sisters are overlapping in the way you drew it, it's overlapping?
Because they're all interacting with each other.
Okay.
And you could draw them overlapping, you can draw them with, it just gets a little bit diagrammatically.
But so they're supposed to be part of both systems? Is that?
Okay, let's start with this. The individual is your focal system. Anything internal to that focal system is a subsystem. Everything external to is a supersystem. So go back to your question. What is your question?
So since you have them circled over the line, is that because they're part of the internal system and the
family system? They're not part of the individual's internal or subsystem.
Right, they're part of the family system and the... And what other system?
Yes? Are you understanding this or not?
Yeah, I understand that.
I mean, these are difficult diagrams to work with because there are so many levels of systems. But what I wanted to show you, because I was just drawing circles last week here and there and everywhere, what is more accurate, a more accurate representation is to show these expanding concentric circles. And then you can show, if you're doing a system diagram, then you can show the relationships between the various components of the system with lines like this. You see how that's a line with a two-way arrow? Yeah, Anna.
I think it helps also, like the book says, to think about the Russian dolls, that they come one within the other, like each
Yeah, the
part.
nesting, the concept of nesting. Concentric circles or the Russian dolls that nest inside each other. Does that help? Thank you. Anybody else? Any questions about this? Okay, we're going to move on. Over to the PowerPoint, please. Today we're going to be talking about conflict theory, or actually conflict theories. Conflict theories. And one of the things that we're going to be taking a look at is how to compare and contrast, because this is called comparative human behavior theory, right? So what we're doing here is comparing and contrasting different kinds of theories and looking at their applicability for social work practice. The theories we talked about last week, systems theories, see society as being based on cooperation, based on consensus, and therefore it gives us a certain model of society that includes some components and leaves out others. Does that make sense, Joe? Okay, we're switching now to the almost opposite set of theories. When I say opposite, it rests on a different or opposite set of assumptions about the nature of society and the nature of social relations. And conflict theories, that we're going to be talking about today, and I'll be calling it theory and theories, it's actually multiple theories. The same way that systems theory is multiple theories and variations thereof, but they all share the same philosophical assumptions. Basically, conflict theory sees society as being based not on cooperation, not on consensus, but on power and on struggles and disparities. Interests. Interests are the basic elements of all social life according to conflict theories. Now, let's talk about that for a second. What do we mean by interests? What do we mean by interests?
Maybe needs that we have, the needs that that human beings have.
Okay, part of it is based on individual needs. Let me ask you a general question. Are the interests, for example, of the faculty in the Graduate College of Social Work necessarily the same as the interests of the administration?
No.
Are the interests of the students necessarily the same as the interests of the faculty?
No.
So, separate from individual interests based on our individual needs, these macro level theories, systems theory and conflict theories, all of them are more based on groups. Certainly, conflict theories are more based on the interests and needs of groups, which, if you look at it from a systems perspective, also boils down to the interests and needs of the individuals who are parts of those groups, right? So what this set of theories says is that one of the basic assumptions is that as individuals and also in social groups, we have different interests. And sometimes our interests overlap, and guess what? Sometimes they don't. And when they don't, what happens?
Conflict
Conflict,
develops.
yeah. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Again, basic assumptions about social life within conflict theories. Social life doesn't involve cooperation and consensus. It involves coercion. It involves the ability of groups to coerce other groups to get their interest needs and needs met. Let's start that over. It involves coercion of one group by another in order for the groups to get their needs met and their interests met. It involves, social life involves groups with different interests. Groups do not have the same interests. Another assumption about social life is that because of this, it generates opposition, exclusion, and hostility. Again, opposition, exclusion, and hostility, which in turn generates what?
Conflict.
You've got to use a mic. Conflict. Do you see how these assumptions are very, very different in these theories? Okay, some of the central ideas of conflict theory are as follows. Social differences involve power. Now, do we find that at all in systems theories? Do we even have the concept of power? Folks, did we or not?
No.
No. In fact, one of the things that we criticize systems theory for is that it ignored the fact that some groups are more powerful than others. Okay, another central idea is that social systems are not united and are not harmonious. Because of their competing and conflictual interests, they are constantly in conflict with one another. And here's another assumption that is really different than systems theory, which is that systems tend to change. Social systems tend to change. If you go back and think about what we said about systems theories, as opposed to the conflict theories assumptions, their main point was stability. Again, we're comparing the two sets of theories. Systems theories see consensus and stability as being the norm and the desired state of a system. Conflict theorists look at exactly the opposite, and in fact, what they're going to say is that it's not stability that is the norm, it is change. The social change is ongoing. It's ongoing, and therefore we can't talk about systems unless we could also talk about the ways in which systems change. Yeah, Dean.
So do systems theory see things like wars and things as a beneficial, a good thing to maintain stability, to get rid of people, or to, I don't know.
Ah, that's a wonder. Did you have your hand on the mic?
Yes.
Okay. No, say it again.
So in systems theories, do they perceive wars as something good that's necessary to maintain balance and harmony?
That would certainly be one interpretation. If a systems theorist is trying to describe the function of the war, and remember, go back to what we said, systems theorists tend to look at the positive functions of different parts of the system for what? For maintaining the whole system. So while it might be a momentary disruption in the system, it's going to self-regulate and self-correct, and they would probably take a look at the positive functions of war and say, well, we've got overpopulation. One of the things that wars do is what? You've got to use
Kill people.
Kill people.
Well, and by killing people, we help solve part of the overpopulation problem. That would be one very extreme way of looking at it. They would see a war that was ongoing as disruptive and not functional to the system, and what would happen, it would put the system into entropy, and the system would eventually become more and more disorganized if the war was very, very long-lasting. And then the question would be, how do we get the system out of this entropic state? But no, systems theorists might take a look at war and say, well, Isn't that nice? War actually has a positive function, not only for the systems that are at war, but possibly for the larger system as well. That's not what conflict theorists would say. Conflict theorists would always look at who's winning and who's losing. What are the structural arrangements that make it, possible, for example, and probable that the people who go to war are not the wealthy kids, the people that tend to join the services on their own when there's not a draft, are people who live in poverty, people who are working class, and they would say there's an unfair balance here, whereas a systems theorist would say, oh no, this is the balance that we need. Does that make sense? Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Another central idea in conflict theories is that every element in society contributes to a change. So the change does not necessarily come from above or below, but the change can come from every element in society. And very important, this is something you're not going to, now that you might also find in systems theory. However, here's the part that you won't find in systems theory, is that every society rests on constraint of some of its members by others. That goes back to the notion of power and power disparities. Again, every society rests on constraint of some of its members by others. Okay, very importantly, something that systems theories do not do, conflict theories focus on the structural arrangements, the structural features of social arrangements. In other words, how is society structured? We'll talk more about that. And very definitely, conflict theories take a look at the ways in which conflict is linked specifically to social change. Okay, today we're going to take a look at three very specific theories. We're going to take a look at Karl Marx's class conflict. And you might think to yourself, why in the world would we want to study Marx? Isn't he dead and buried, and isn't communism gone? Well, first of all, communism isn't gone. And when we take a look at what I'm going to call really lasting ideas, lasting theories, this is a theory that has undergirded many other theories that have spun off from Karl Marx's original works. We're also going to be taking a look at a different variation of conflict theory, C. Wright Mills's power elite. And finally, we're going to take a look at interest group theory. These are three of the predominant conflict theories and their spin-offs that are used in the field of sociology. Okay, let's start with Karl Marx's conflict theory, his social class conflict theory. It emerged from a historical context. You always have to remember that. People will say, oh, Marx is irrelevant. What he predicted never came about. Well, Marx is not irrelevant. And you've got to remember this about theory in general. When we take a look at any theory, we also have to take a look at the theorist. We have to take a look at the historical time frame in which that person was writing, because a person's ideas are influenced not only by things that internally are generated, but a person's ideas, and we're going to take a look at this in more detail today, are also linked very directly to the time period in which they live. Concepts that we have today, because of technology, simply didn't exist 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So that any theorist, the time in which they're writing their theory, the social and economic and political forces that are occurring during that time period actually have a lot to do with the theory that emerges. So when I say that, we have to look at Marx within his historical context. He was writing at the time of the massive industrial revolution in Europe. So what he was looking at and responding to is massive social change. Massive social change. We talked a little bit about what that looked like in the United States, and it looked very similar. We have people whose lives had been significantly changed because of technology, the technology that brought us the machinery for mass production of goods. which previously didn't exist. So when I say that we have to view him in his historical context, we cannot take him out of his context. Okay, Marx talked about, this is the part of Marx that everybody seems to know, he talked about two social classes, two primary social classes. The bourgeoisie, who were the people who owned the means of production, and the proletariat, who were the worker bees, who were being exploited by the folks that own the means of production. I think that's the part of the theory that most people most easily identify with. His theory is much, much deeper than that, however. And in fact, he talked not only about those two social classes, those were his primary classes. He also had a class of administrators, the petty bourgeoisie. He also talked a little bit about landlords. Those were minor classes. And another class that he talked about were, I love this, the lumpen proletariat. Essentially, they were the drug addicts, the thieves, the ne'er-do-wells, the people who did not work and contribute to society. Did not work and contribute to society. So let's take a look at the basis of his theory. And I want to let you know in advance, this is what I'm going to call the 5-cent version. His theory is much deeper and much more complex than anything that I could describe to you in the time period that we have, so you can go back to the textbook and read more about what his theory said. Another place to get very good information on his theory, if you just Google his name, you will find a lot of very good scholarly articles on Marx. According to Marx, that shift, the shift to industrialization, created a form of capitalism that we had never seen before. Again, it created a form of capitalism that we had never seen before in the world, in the history of the world. Marx was essentially a sociologist and a historian, in a sense. He was looking at historical changes over time in the structure of society. And in his theory, he actually talked about how these changes led up to that point in time in which capitalism, and a very competitive form of capitalism, had emerged thanks to technology. So he was concerned about several things, but he was primarily concerned about the fact that the wealthy control the means of production. In other words, they control the machinery. They own the machinery, and for the first time in society, people had to sell their labor. Think about that for a second. That's a fairly profound change. Prior to that, how did people live? How did people make a living?
You lived off the land, basically. You farmed your own product and traded with other people.
You traded with other people. When you sold your own work, it was something that you had created. You weren't working for somebody else. So he said one of the first corrupting influences is the fact that people who own the means of production have a way of exploiting those who don't. And back to the PowerPoint for a second. In addition to that, the wealthy not only control whether or not you can work and how much you're going to make, but they also control the dominant ideologies. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that today, the dominant ideologies. What he said essentially is that the means and tools of production, the ownership of that is very specific to capitalistic societies. And what happens is that it becomes concentrated in the hands of a very few people. Therefore, what happens is that the people who own the machinery get to hire you at a price that they think is fair. You might not think it's fair, but if you want to work, you have to work for their price. Does that make sense? Now you might think, well, if this person isn't paying me enough, I'm going to go to this other person. But that person wants to make a profit too, and he's probably going to be competing with the other person. And therefore, why would he want to pay you more when he knows that the other owner is paying you less? So it's kind of an existential dilemma that workers were set into, in that they were forced to sell their labor, whether or not they thought the price that they were getting was fair or not. With that, according to Marx, one of the problems that emerges is exploitation. Another problem that emerges is what he called surplus value. This is a really interesting concept. He defines surplus value as the difference between the selling price of an item and the cost of the labor to produce it. Again, surplus value, according to Marx, the difference between what the item sells for and what it costs the manufacturer, the person who owned the means of production, to produce it. He says this becomes further complicated when the person who put the work into making this item then goes to purchase this item at a very highly marked up price. So they're exploiting not only your labor, but your purchasing power as well. With this, and I've got a great quote for you, with this comes poverty. According to Marx, and I'm going to read his direct quote, accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole. Essentially what he's saying is that in a capitalist society, in order for the wealthy to be wealthy and to maintain their wealth, they had a vested interest in keeping the poor poor. And in this case, it was only two social classes essentially that he was talking about, the workers and the wealthy. So the wealthy exploit the poor in order to make a profit, and the poor live in misery. Another thing that happens, according to Marx, is the problem of what he called alienation. Alienation. It's a process by which people become estranged. They become demeaned. They become depersonalized and powerless. Let's think about this for a second. Okay, away from the slide now. Let's think about this for a minute. How can people become alienated? Have you all read the chapter? Yes. Okay, in what ways did Marx say that people became alienated? What causes that alienation? So we read without memory. Okay.
Well, you're not participating. You have no.
It's it's really hard when you're a hand talker to hold down.
You're not able to participate in the process, so you become an outsider, and that causes alienation. You have no hope if you're not in the right as an owner of the means of production or whatever. If you're in the opposite, you can't participate in that process. You're an outsider and feel alienation.
Well, it's not that they didn't participate, it's that they had a very subscribed small role. Anna?
Also, I think that they are participating in producing the item with their labor, but knowing that they were not going to be able to acquire that wood or that merchandise. So that is frustrating for them.
Okay, so we have frustration that comes with that. Yeah.
What I read is that they were oppressed, so the oppression would keep them, at a different level.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That goes along with the misery and the oppression. What he saw as being the alienation, very, very significantly, is that when people, historically, for example, were shoemakers, were tailors, they were working on a piece from the beginning to the end, and they had an attachment with the product they were producing. That makes sense? Mm-hmm. They saw it through from beginning to end, and they had an investment and an attachment to their own work because it was their own work. Here we have a very, very different scenario with the beginning of industrialization, where people were in factory assembly lines. So my job might be to turn this knob, and turn this knob, and turn this knob in order to make a product that 50, 75, 100 other people might be working on, turning a different knob, screwing something else in. You're following that? Mm-hmm. And people have no attachment to the product that they're making. They have no vested interest in what comes out because they never get to see the whole thing. So they are alienated not only from their work and their product, but Marx also saw this as a process of alienation from themselves. From themselves. Okay, very importantly, Marx said, now this is a big problem in terms of economic ideology, that it's okay to continue like this. But it's also a problem because those who have the wealth and have the power manage to transform that economic power into political power. Because their interests are coalesced together and they band together, what they end up doing is that political institutions become subservient to the wealthy. Again, the political institutions, because of the power that the wealthy have, political institutions become subservient to the wealthy. Okay, away from the PowerPoint for a minute. Can you give me some examples in contemporary society?
Oil and gas companies.
Go ahead, Tony.
Oil and gas companies.
Okay, what about them?
Corporations. When originally corporations were given for only a certain amount of time. Today, when you become incorporated, you could be incorporated forever, and that corporation, the more power it has, that it actually can wield power and keep other technologies like the oil and gas companies have. The combustion engine's been obsolete for 50 or 100 years now, and they've kept that technology from coming forward because it's in their best interest.
Okay. How else might they corrupt the political process?
Would lobbies be
Lobbies would be a very good example. You and I, if we have something that we want Congress to do, to pass policies and laws for us, do we have the ability to do that?
No.
Well, yes and no. I mean, technically speaking, we can write to our Congress people, right? But it's not the same as having a lobbyist. Not the same as having a lobbyist taking them out to dinners, trying to get legislation passed in their own interests. Not the individual's interest, but in the company's interests. So what he was really pointing to is that once you have an accumulation of wealth at the top, it affects not only economics, but it also affects the political process, because they have the ability to corrupt the political process for their own means, which is, of course, in their interests and not in whose interests?
People,
the people, right?
Society's interest.
The majority of society. The wealthy do not represent the majority of society. They represent themselves. And we're going back to the notion of competing interests. The interests of the wealthy are not the same as the interests of the worker. And if the wealthy have the ability to amass their economic power into political power, then they also have political power over the workers, not just economic power. Does that make sense to y'all? Just as importantly, maybe more importantly, or equally importantly, the wealthy or the bourgeoisie not only control the economics and the markets, they not only control policies and political processes, but they control our ideas. They control the ideas by which we understand the world. Folks, that's a fairly profound statement. Away from the PowerPoint for a minute. Think about that. Have you ever thought about anybody controlling your ideas? And I'm not talking about, oh, there are people buzzing things into my head through the television. Okay? I'm talking, have you ever thought about the fact that your ideas are controlled? In what ways?
Media.
Media. In what ways does the media shape what we believe?
Well, in the way that they represent an issue sways our opinion about the issue.
Absolutely. The way that they represent an issue, and all you have to do is take a look at competing media as to the take that they have on things, and depending on what you listen to, you're going to get very different information. And if you go on the internet and read papers from Europe, newspapers from Europe, or magazines from Europe, you're going to see very, very different slants. However, what Marx would say, now you've got to remember that what exists today did not exist in his time, the kind of media that we're talking about. But Marx would say that whatever media, and the media did not play as big a role back then, other forces did, because we didn't have this mass media. We didn't have the mass media. But today, we have mass media. And who do you think owns the mass media?
Wealthy.
Wealthy.
The wealthy. And what we see today, and again, Marx did not account for this because he was not a futurist in terms of the ability to see into the technological advances of the future. So he talked about other means of control, mind control, idea control. Not mind control in the sense of somebody's trying to do something to hurt me, although he did see it that way. He saw the wealthy controlling the ideas of the poor for their own interests. And increasingly, what we see in the United States and in the world today is that the media today, increasingly, the people who own it, the groups get smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's only a handful of people and boards of directors that own world media. I mean, literally. And there's been quite a bit of research on this. Okay, so we're going back to the idea that the bourgeoisie control the ideas by which people understand the world around them. What Marx said is that people who control the ideas control the dominant ideologies. What do we mean by ideology? I want to be sure we're all on the same page. What do we mean by ideology when we talk about ideology? It's one that there is religious ideology, definitely.
Like a belief system?
Yeah, it's whatever the dominant belief system is in a given era or period of time. The dominant belief system at a given period of time or era. So what Marx says, going back to the PowerPoint, is that the ideologies of any age represent and reflect the interests of the wealthy, not of the average person. However, these ideologies, the reason that we buy into them is that even though they don't represent us, they are presented as being universal, as being timeless, as being unmutable. What Marx said is that ideology is used as a form of social control. We're going to come back and talk more about this in terms of the different kinds of ideologies and the ways in which ideology controls people. Ideology, according to Marx, also disguises conflicting class interests. Disguises conflicting class interests. If we can buy into an ideology that furthers our own exploitation, we do not get to see how we are being exploited. Does that make sense? Another thing that ideology does is that it subdues class conflict. If we don't see that we are being exploited, what happens? We buy into our own exploitation and we have no reason to rebel against it. That make sense? And very importantly, ideology reinforces the status quo. And the status quo is a question of those at the top are winning and those at the bottom are losing. And our belief system, the things that we believe, the things that we internalize as being good, proper, and correct, further our own exploitation by reinforcing that status quo. Let me stop here for questions. None? Yeah.
So the oppressed don't see their oppression?
You still have to be...
Oppressed don't see their oppression? They don't... If...
No, according to Marx, no, they don't. They have so bought into this system and the ideas and beliefs of what the wealthy want us to think, because it furthers their ability to stay wealthy and to keep poor people poor, that, no, the poor do not see their oppression.
Doesn't he mention also the state of false consciousness? That
Yep.
He mentions the development of false consciousness, which is accepting the reality that others impose on you, and that reality just furthers down your oppression.
Yes, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. Yes, and false consciousness, according to Marx, is not something that only the oppressed have, but the oppressors also have a false consciousness. Yeah, Tony, and then Neftali. Oh, no, okay, Neftali.
Did he have any suggestions on how to get to have a balance between the two groups? To any ideas on what the oppressed needed to do?
Workers of the world unite. Yes, here is where his theory was off. Yes, his answer, and he saw this, by the way, as being a natural progression. He thought that capitalism as it existed back then was going to do itself in. He thought that it was inevitable that workers would eventually free themselves from the constraints of their beliefs and unite together to overthrow capitalism. And what he saw as being the next step was socialism and communism. Now, clearly, that happened in certain countries, but it didn't happen worldwide as he had predicted it did. So I think people very often say he was a fairly good sociologist in terms of describing the structures of society and the forces at the time, but not a very good futurist. Other questions? Yeah, Leah.
I thought that was very interesting because communist states in practice tend to be very heavily censored educationally and by the government, and that's not what he intended.
That's not what he intended at all. The form of what he did not foresee also was that countries that did adopt communism became very repressive states. And that was not the form of communism that he ever envisioned. So again, he was short-sighted in not seeing that as well. Yeah, Anna.
Because he basically envisioned a place where almost in heaven you're going to get it. It was like very utopical, like everybody equal and everybody with the same rights, no more oppressors. So that hasn't happened up to date.
That hasn't happened anywhere. Yes, what he envisioned was a utopia that never happened. But even when communism did happen, it was not his vision of it whatsoever. What is really interesting is that socialism did occur in many countries and still exists in many countries. And we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about that when we talk about ideology and economic ideology. Okay, back to the PowerPoint for a minute. The dominant ideologies that Marx was most concerned with, this is not exhaustive, but this is the ones he was most concerned with, was religious ideology, political ideology, and economic ideology. Now here we get to false consciousness. Thank you, Anna. What he said is that classes in a capitalistic system that was so heavily divided between the poor and the wealthy, he said that eventually people will come to have a class consciousness. They will be very aware that, in other words, the workers will be very aware that they are workers and that they do not have what the wealthy have. Remember, back then there was no strong middle class. It was literally, the majority of people were working in the factories. And a small minority were the people who owned the machinery of production. And what he said is that eventually the classes will become obvious to people, not only to the poor but also to the wealthy, that they are going to understand that they are part of a class that is separate from the class of the poor. Similarly, the poor will develop a class consciousness and see that they are part of a class of the poor and not of the wealthy. However, he described this as being a false consciousness. And he says that false consciousness occurs when people accept definitions of reality that further their own oppression. Let me repeat that. False consciousness occurs when people accept definitions of reality that further their own oppression. What is interesting is that Marx said that false consciousness occurs not only with the poor, but also with the wealthy. Again, false consciousness occurs not only with the poor, but also with the wealthy. That the wealthy, in believing that they have to keep this structure, have just as much of a false consciousness as do the poor. Any questions about that? Oops. Okay, let's go back and talk a little bit about religious ideology. Religious ideology. Marx said real clearly, everybody know his favorite quote, the most famous quote about religion?
Opiate of the masses.
Got to use the mics.
The opium of the nations. Or
The religion, he said, is the opium of the masses. What did he mean by that? What did he mean by that? Anybody? Okay.
I was going to say earlier that a lot of people do believe, well, have thoughts that churches are used to control people, like what they think and how they behave and that.
You know, that would certainly be part of conflict theory. And that's a very good example, by the way. If we think about, let's compare a little bit. What will systems theory say about religion and churches? We're looking for the positive functions. What are some of the positive functions of religion? Yeah.
That it unites people, it makes them feel good, it makes them feel better, tells them, to be kind to people and good and all of that, that kind of thing. It promotes positive actions from people.
Okay, promotes positive actions, promotes cohesiveness, teaches them values. Anything else that religion does? Churches do? Yeah. Lorena.
It helps them maintain the status quo.
And in systems theory, that would be good. Again, yeah. It helps them maintain the status quo, which is a healthy, according to systems theories, which is healthy for the system. What else do churches and religion do? Positive functions. Gives us place to gather. Gives us outlets to meet other people with similar beliefs. There are many, many positive functions. Yeah. Andrea.
The church also helps to maintain identities in the community.
I can't hear you. Helps maintain
identities in the community?
Absolutely. The church helps to maintain identities in the community. Those are all very positive functions that reinforce the status quo. Okay, now we turn to conflict theory. And what would Marx say about religion?
That it keeps you from focusing on your oppression and your inequality. It's like figuring you're going to have a better life in the afterlife, and so don't worry about what's happening today. You will get your reward in heaven.
Absolutely. It reinforces the status quo by having us focus on our afterlife. Therefore, if we are so focused on doing good deeds for our afterlife, we pay no attention to the structural inequality in which we exist. Yeah. Anna.
In Mexico, in the history of Mexico, we have a very clear example of that when the Spaniards came and conquered the native people there. Mm-hmm. They catechized or converted everybody to Catholicism, and up to now, many forms of oppression happen because of that, under that segment of the society, of the system.
Yes, one of the things that a conflict theorist would say is that religions are always competing with each other. And therefore, when people get conquered, they are forced to take on the religion of the conquering group, whether they want to or not. And what's really interesting, if you take a look at the way different groups have adapted to that, historically, some groups assimilate totally to the new religion, and other groups tend to they assimilate partly to the religion, and they keep their original beliefs as well. But certainly they are forced and coerced into taking on a religion that was not theirs. What else would a Marxist say about religion? Yeah.
It doesn't make people examine the status quo, because if you feel like society is the way it is because God wants it that way, you're not going to want to change it.
Yes, if you accept an ideology that if God wanted things different, it would be different, and therefore we're going to accept the way it is in subservience to God. Any other ideas about what a Marxist would say? Yeah, Linda.
The oppression becomes internalized, and so your lot in life, this is what you've got.
Religion helps us accept our lot in life. Absolutely. Helps us accept our lot in life, and therefore we stop focusing on our lot in life. We stop focusing on the disparities between the very wealthy and the very poor, and we're in the very poor, or the worker bees, and therefore that enables the status quo to maintain itself. Have you ever thought about religion as mind control before? Yes? Some of you have. But yet, most of us continue to follow, to some degree or another, some religious or spiritual beliefs. And do you think that he has? Do you think that he accurately described the way religion controls people? Yes. No. I see you shaking your head, but nobody can hear you. Do you have problems with that? Anybody have a problem with that interpretation about religion?
I think it depends on the individual. If you have an intrinsic sort of religiosity where it's you do good because you're not expecting a reward, but you're expecting just to be good. But if you're looking for that extrinsic reward, I think it's a little bit different, I guess.
He was talking about organized religion, not people's individual spirituality. And I think that he would argue that if you take a look at any organized religion, that it socializes you to a set of beliefs that, while you think it's your own beliefs, these are beliefs that really are passed down from the wealthy of any generation going back because it supports their ability to keep their wealth and to keep you in poverty. So again, we're talking about organized religion. And you also have to understand that he was writing from a very Judeo-Christian framework. The time he was writing from a very Judeo-Christian framework. Okay. Political ideology. This is a good one. Political ideology manifests itself as nationalism, patriotism, right? If we can get people to buy into the idea that they must be patriotic towards their country, that their nation above all, and don't we do that in the United States? Yes? Can you give me some examples?
The Iraqi War.
Okay, what about the Iraqi War?
They convinced us that to go there was in our best interest, that we were, if not, we're going to be attacked and, terrorists would come and wipe us out if we didn't go.
Here's a very good example how, in Marxist formulation, the wealthy who own, not in this case, not only the machinery that makes manufactured goods, but the machinery that makes, what? Guns, right? Guns, battleship. Isn't it in their best interest to have wars? Yes? And what Marx would say is that because the wealthy have the ability to persuade political power, that they have the ability to persuade politicians to say yes to war. Yes? Yes. And not only do they have the ability to persuade the politicians to say yes to war, but they also have the ability, through our religious beliefs, through the media, to get us to buy in too. Through the political belief system of nationalism. The idea that we must support our troops. We must support the war, and if we don't, we are what? Un-American. Yes? Haven't you heard that slammed at different people who said they don't support the war? You're un-American. How could you not support the war? It's these larger ideologies that we must support what our country does, wrong or right. That we're not patriotic if we question what the government does. We're not patriotic if we question wars. Yeah.
And it kind of goes into how, as kids, we're taught to say the Pledge of Allegiance, like every morning, and already getting you in the mind frame that, patriotism is where we should be just from a young age.
Absolutely. We get socialized into being patriotic from a very young age, and that's a very good example. I know when I was growing up, we stood up with the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. And therefore, that kind of socialization, again, I'm calling this mind control. I don't mean, you understand what I'm talking about, yes? Mm-hmm. That when they can socialize us to this from very early ages, it becomes so ingrained in us that we don't even question it. Leah.
Oh, I was going to say the way the last word that she was talking about, we had the axis of evil that labeled entire sections. You're either with us or you are evil.
Yes.
And that's a way of influencing public opinion.
That's a really good example, too. That they come up with these campaigns to let us know that there is evil out there. And if you're not with us, then you're against us. If you question us, then you're against us. Absolutely.
Dr. Robbins, what was different in the Vietnam War, where there was a lot more rebelling and speaking out against that war? What could have been in the...
Anybody want to take a stab at that? Yeah, Tony.
I think during that war, we were allowed to see media images on TV of actual dead bodies, and Whereas this war, they sort of censor that stuff. You don't see people, our soldiers carrying their fellow dead soldier's body around. We're censored to that, I think. That's
certainly part of the dynamics. Anybody else? What was different?
Was the hippie days after the war, or was it
during?
So it was during. I mean, was it an after effect of it, or was it because we were in those times that there was more of that rebelling, or what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing?
I think that you have to look at that period of time as being one of massive social change in general. Separate from the Vietnam War, we also saw, we talked about this last week, we saw the beginning of the civil rights movement, people gaining access to the media and speaking out, people banding together. About the same time, and it was actually the Vietnam War that spurred people into even more activism, because it was a war, unlike World War I and World War II or even the Korean War, where people were not on board. Another thing, and here's a big difference, we had a draft. We can't go back and say this wouldn't have happened if we didn't have a draft, because you can't predict something that didn't happen. But I think a significant factor in the Vietnam War was the fact that we had a draft. So we were not just sending the poor folks over there who voluntarily signed up for service because they needed the educational benefits or the pay. We were drafting wealthy people as well. Not to the same extent, because there were always exemptions, particularly for education. But I think that was probably one of the biggest factors, that the wealthy got their children recruited as well. And therefore, we saw a very different take in Vietnam, where there was a lot of discontent. However, I'd like to point out that a lot of the discontent arose during the long period of the war, but a lot of the discontent happened afterwards as well. People who came back bitter over what had happened, and bitter at the way they were treated. Soldiers who came back very bitter over the way that they were treated when they were over there. I mean, because of the draft, we saw people trying to get out of the service, doing everything they could not to get drafted. But we also had patriots who felt it was their duty to go to war, right or wrong. It goes back to the idea of patriotism and nationalism, that if my country wants me to serve, then I'm going to serve proudly because my country, right or wrong. See how this all fits together? Linda, you had your hand up?
I was just going to say the social movements at that time.
Mm-hmm. So the country was structurally ripe at that point in time for massive social change. However, I'd like to point out that the change that occurred was significant, but it wasn't an overturning of the government. It wasn't the kind of overturning of the governments that Marx saw with his Workers of the World Unite. This was slow, incremental change. And you have change that is both progressive and regressive. So systems theory really better describes the kind of change that happened, even though while it was happening, it felt very disruptive. Any questions about Marx? Okay, we're going to move to the tablet for a minute. So Marx's social classes, as he envisioned them, this is what it would look like. Is that right? This is very hard for a left-handed person to work with his tablet, I got to tell you that. Essentially, he saw two social classes: the wealthy and the not wealthy. Okay. We're going to turn now to the theories of C. Wright Mills, which is also a conflict theorist. I'm going to show you how his theory is similar but somewhat different. So the PowerPoint, please. C. Wright Mills is a sociologist who, in 1956, took a look at the power structure in the United States, and what he said is that America is run by a small group of men. And this small group of men formulates almost all of our policy. Again, the small group of men formulates almost all of our policy. What is significant about C. Wright Mill's power elite is that even though these are the men that are running this country, they are not accountable to us. Not accountable to us. And very importantly, they're not only not accountable, guess what? They're not known to us. We don't even know who they are. We might know the names of several of them who are prominent and in the media all the time, but by and large, he said this is a hidden group. A hidden group. And away from the PowerPoint. What he said, he was doing essentially a historical analysis of how power has changed. And what he said is that historically, America has moved away from what he saw as being small competing interest groups that were brought in by the American Revolution. And again, historically, he was tracing the power, and he said, after the American Revolution, what happened is that industrialization, so we're back to Marx's proposition, that industrialization gave rise to and gave power to essentially one group of men, specifically the industrialists. So he was commenting on the Industrial Revolution in much the same way. His analysis was the same as Marx. What C. Wright Mill said is that with the Industrial Revolution, we moved away from competing interest groups and moved to, specifically, the industrialists who held all the power. Aha, but that's not the end of the story. Remember what I said earlier about how you've got to put people within the time frame and period in which they're writing? Well, by the 1950s, Mills took a look and he said, as he was analyzing the power structures of society, he said it's no longer the wealthy industrialists that run everything. That was true in Marx's era. That was true in the early 1900s. However, he said there has been a change. And if you take a look at the changes that have occurred between 1900 through the 1950s, the economic crisis, the crash of the stock market in the 1930s, and very specifically, FDR's New Deal, cut down significantly on the political influence of the wealthy for that period of time. However, it also gave rise to power of different groups. Gave rise to power of different groups. Very specifically, it gave rise to a new group having some of the power, which are the government planners and executives. The minute that we have the New Deal and we have the government now stepping in, we cut down on the power of the wealthy industrialists, and we have new groups that start to emerge, specifically in the public sector. Then he said, we can't stop there. That if you then go further in time, what happened in World War II, who owns the machinery of war? Folks, back to the wealthy industrialists, so they got some of their power back. World War II gave them some of their power back, and the response to the Cold War strategy also gave power to another group, our military leaders. So, to the tablet again, please. What C. Wright Mills says is that it's not the two classes that Marx envisioned, but rather in his formulation we have three social classes, three primary classes that we need to be concerned about. The first one, at the very top, is the power elite. Is that legible? Yeah, more or less. Now, this power elite is not Marx's power elite of only industrialists. It now consists of three specific groups: industrialists, government planners, and top military officials. So it's no longer just the wealthy, but some of these people have wealth, some of them do not, some of them simply have status. Remember, this is the 1950s. I think we could easily argue today that in today's society, if you're looking at a power elite, they probably also have money as well. But back then, there were some people who had status and privilege and did not have a whole lot of money. That was still part of the power elite because of where they were structurally located in government. He said, below that, going back to my diagram, below that level, we have, at the very bottom, let's go to the bottom first. Here we have the masses. And the masses were the worker bees. They included all of us. It included, now we have something else in society that didn't exist in Marx's time, which is what? A growing middle class. Growing middle class. I'm looking for my diagram here. Okay, so here we have the power elite at the very top. We have the masses. That still looks like Marx's diagram, right? However, Mills introduced another group in here, and he said that in between the two, we have a middle level of power. And these are the congressmen and women. Back then, it was congressmen. 50s, right? Here we have people in Congress. We also have interest groups. So we have now this middle layer. What does that middle layer do? What does that middle layer do? Yeah, Anna.
They just execute.
Back over to me, please. Go ahead.
Execute the orders of the power elite.
Absolutely. What Mills said is that even though we think that Congress makes laws, even though we think that they do, because what do they do at every legislative session? They come out with laws, right? They come out with policies. He says it's all an illusion. That in fact, they are simply there to rubber stamp the will of the elite. They are there to rubber stamp the will of the elite. And that the idea that policy is made by Congress, in Mills's formulation, was simply an illusion. Under that level are the masses, who are essentially powerless. And I want you to hear the similar tones in what he is saying and what Marx said. He said that we as the masses are swayed by the elites because the elites, now here we are in the 1950s where we did have media, not the media that we have today, but the elites, according to Mills, have the ability to sway our decisions and our beliefs and what we think by their ability to manipulate the media.
Because they own it.
Yes. The elites own the media, and therefore they have the ability to have us take positions on things and sway our beliefs by what the media represents. I'm going to give you a really graphic description of that where I think this really, really holds true. Back when the war on drugs first started, we were swamped with all kinds of images about how bad all of these illegal drugs are, to the point that there was a point in history, in the 1980s, where the majority of American citizens were willing to give up their civil rights to fight the war on drugs. They were willing to have police come in and search their houses unannounced, without warrants, because drugs are this horrible evil. Not all drugs, just certain drugs. Can you think of other examples about how the elites might sway our minds about certain things? Yeah, Rochelle.
That kind of goes back to the Iraqi war, how privacy, how some citizens were willing to give up their right to privacy because of the war. So they said it's okay if you tap our phones or go through our emails, if we just feel like a safer country. So the citizens just want to feel safe, and they didn't care about their own privacy, so they give up some of their privacy rights.
Very good example, very good example. Any other examples? Worry about the elite's ability to convince us that we need more and more of certain products and items. Folks, we live in a consumer culture. In fact, some of the neo-Marxists, people writing after Marx, say that we live in a culture of waste, where we produce waste and waste the waste. The ability of the media to sway us in our tastes, to sway us in the things that we think that we need, are all part of this system. First over here, Andrea.
Well, I was thinking about how the elite convince us that it's okay that there are a few elite, and that because we are like the worker bees, we can work up to that one day, even though it might not necessarily be obtainable, but we think that it is, so we don't say, well, there's not enough elite, but we think we can work to get there.
Yeah, part of capitalist ideology is the idea that anybody can succeed through their own hard work. And therefore, if you are poor, it is your fault that you're poor. It has nothing to do with the structural elements of society. It's your inability to be a good worker, be a hard worker, do what you need to do, so that if you don't make it, the blame, the onus of responsibility is on you, not on the system. Any other examples? Yeah.
Doesn't this also maybe apply to, like, when you go to the airport and they're like practically fondling you and strip searching you when you're there, and we just say that it's okay because they want to protect us from any bad actions?
That's a very good example of it. The more that you keep people afraid of some external threat, whether it be drugs, whether it be terrorists, the more that you can convince them through the media that we need to hop on board this bandwagon and not question it.
Well, the other thing, too, is through the airport, they always, every time you're in there, they're saying, orange alert, orange alert. It's like all over just any moment, something's going to blow up.
Well, with 9/11 came a massive change in the United States. It was the first massive attack, major attack that we had ever had on our shores. Other wars that we have fought have been overseas. So that was a very, very significant difference. And it became easier and easier to convince people that all of these methods of screening that they use are going to somehow keep us safer. There have been some really good exposés written about that, by the way. Very good exposés about how it really doesn't keep us any safer whatsoever. What keeps us safer is the fact that people cannot get into the cockpit anymore, and that people who are on the plane are not likely to put up with an attack. Those are the two things that really keep us safer. Okay. What Mill said is that these folks, the power elite, go about their business passing policies that are in their interests and against our interests. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't sometimes throw us bones. Well, wouldn't it be in their interest to do that? Yes or no? Absolutely. Because if there's too much of an uprising, it threatens their ability, and therefore they throw us bones, for example, in the form of welfare payments, any kind of payments to families or children made by the government. What function does that have? Aside from keeping them out of poverty. I'm talking about function for the power elite. Yeah. First over here.
Where there won't be a rebellion or an uprising.
Yes, if you've got a stake in the system, you're not going to uprise against it. You're not going to rise up against it. There won't be rebellion. So the more we have social programs, the more it keeps those who are the most powerless more quiet. Yeah, Tony.
I was going to say, the money just goes back in their pocket anyway, because you put it back in the economy. So
yeah, the money goes back in their pocket anyway. Yeah.
I was thinking of the way McDonald's serves this horribly unhealthy food, but it has the Ronald McDonald House Charity. So you don't think I'm getting a heart attack over here. You think I'm supporting these poor children.
And when we talk about McDonald's, any fast food enterprise, they are there for profit. They are there for profit. And therefore, they're not there to serve more expensive healthy foods. But they give to charity, so that makes them okay. Yeah, Andrea?
I was thinking about like the stimulus check so that we can boost the economy again and just give you a lump sum so you can go spend it really fast.
Yeah, and they're really open about that. The lump sum is not so you can save it, which is what we probably need to do, but the lump sum is so that we can spend it on goods that we don't need. And I've got to admit, I'm just as guilty as anybody else. Okay, let me ask you, did Mills think that this was a conspiracy? Did Mills think it was a conspiracy? Well, doesn't it sound like a conspiracy? If these folks are getting together, influencing social policy at that middle level, that then gets enacted on us without our permission, but we think, and here's the point, that we are tricked into believing that, according to his theory, that if we write to our senators, we write to our congressmen, that that's the way to bring about change. Is it a conspiracy? Yeah.
No, he didn't think it was a conspiracy. It was just community interest of the elite.
It's what he called a coincidence of interests. I don't know if any of you here ever used to watch the TV show Dallas. Anybody?
Yeah.
It was J.R. Ewing going to the Cattlemen's Club and just doing business as usual. What Mills said is essentially that these folks live in similar places. They go to country clubs that you and I can't afford and can't have access to. And in the course of doing their everyday business, they are not conspiring against us. They have interlocking interests to keep themselves wealthy. And that is simply the way the business is done. Simply the way the business is done. The fact that they control that middle level of power is simply the way the business is done. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay. So we have the military leaders, just recapping. We have the corporation directors and the government planners and executives. So according to Mills, that is what makes up the power elite. We're going to turn now to any questions about the power elite. Do you see how what Mills did was simply build on Marxist theory and then adjust it historically for what had happened socially and politically in between the time that Marx was writing and the times that Mills was writing it? But essentially their analysis of the power structure was very, very similar. Very similar. And the other thing that had happened in the interim between the 1850s and 1950s in the United States was the rise of the middle class. Once you have a middle class, they've got a vested interest in not becoming poor, right? They have a vested interest in keeping the system and keeping the status quo. Any questions about either Marx or Mills? And again, I urge you to look at the book and take a look at the different variations of theories that have spun off of both of these theorists. Okay, we're going to turn to a different kind of theory now. Also, this is also a conflict theory in the conflict vein. And this is a theory that says there is no one group in control. It's a theory that still buys into the fact that there's constant competition and conflict between groups. But this theory, it's called pluralist theory, or sometimes called interest group theory, or veto group, V-E-T-O, group theory. These are theorists who say, wait a minute. What you're describing when you describe an elite is not correct. They say, if you take a look at the reality of society, we have groups that sometimes cooperate with each other. And we also have groups that sometimes compete with each other. So therefore, to say that it's all based on competition for scarce resources is not correct, because we have groups that do both. What is important about this theory and distinguishes it from the other conflict theories is that this theory says that no single group has all of the control. No single group has all of the control. That what happens is that each group pursues its own interests through a political process. And that because groups compete with each other sometimes, cooperate with each other sometimes. Let's go back to the tablet for a minute. Come on. That But you get a model that looks more like this. If you have group A that does not have a whole lot of power, and you have group B that does have a lot of power, then at any point, where group B has more power than group A, group B is going to have its policies enacted. However, that's not the end of the story. Because group A, if it can garner enough support from other groups and other people to get added influence, at some point that balance might shift. That makes sense, Joe? Okay. So essentially, what this theory is saying is that the power can easily shift at any point. Can you think of examples where policies are enacted because of interest groups?
Well, like right now when change in government from Democratic to Republican. Republican for Democratic.
Okay. Anytime you see shifts in government, and we don't know how big that shift is really going to be, I think that many people would argue today that whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, at the fringes, that most people are fairly centrist. Most people are fairly centrist, whether they be Republican or Democrat. Let me put it to you this way. Do you think the Democrats, even today, are going to overturn the system? Or are they going to make small incremental changes? But, yeah, small changes, however, there will be change that is made. So that's one good example. Can you think of any specific interest groups who have had significant impact on policy?
Civil rights movement?
Yeah, the civil rights movement is a very good example of that. People banding together and demanding social change. Demanding social change. Other interest groups.
The feminist movement?
Feminist movement. And what do the groups need to do? They need to get added power and influence in order to affect the political process. The gay rights movement. Gay rights movement. Do you remember? I hope that you've heard of some words in your other courses. Homosexuality used to be seen as a mental disorder. And it took interest groups, gay rights advocates, to get that policy changed within the psychiatric community. Right now, there's a similar battle going on for transgendered rights. However, they do not have the numbers. Remember, it's added numbers and powers. If we're talking about the balancing of interest groups, it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds. It'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Can you think of any other examples? Yeah.
What about the environmentalists?
Absolutely. And who's on the opposite side of the environmentalists? Big oil, right? Yes, corporations, big oil. What this theory says is that it's not a single group that makes these policies. It is not a single elite, but rather these policies keep shifting due to added power, added influence in any interest group. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Very different model. And again, you can read more about pluralist theories. One of the things that pluralist theorists point out is that even the structure of the U.S. government keeps any one branch of the government from having too much power. That there are always, remember I used the term before, countervailing powers. There are always people with opposite interests who are always looking to change that shift in balance. Which theory is right? Let's go back to this board a minute. To the diagram. Let me see if I can scroll it up. Oh, this is not cooperating with me. For me. There we go. If you ask Mills would acknowledge interest groups. He'd say, okay, they're right here. But they're meaningless in Mills's formulation. Which theory do you think is right? No ideas? All of them. Each one of them holds a different piece of social reality. I think that we can't just ignore the influence of competing interest groups. And I think that many of us have a hard time accepting the fact that the power elite might exist. Why would we have a hard time accepting that? Yeah, Jean.
Maybe we're part of that elite ourselves.
Okay, if you're a part of that elite, I know that I'm not, that's for
Not
sure.
either.
But those who are a part of the elite, they know that they exist. They know that they exist. But the rest of us, why would we have a hard time accepting that that's even a possibility? Tony. This Tony.
They don't want to believe that they're being controlled by somebody.
We don't want to believe that we're being controlled. We don't want to believe that we are powerless. And think about what that would do to us if we really believed that we were powerless. So it goes back to the control of ideology. And the more that we can divert people's attention to, that's the other thing, the more that we can divert people's attention to terrorist attacks, the more we can divert people's attention to a war on drugs, to other outside evils, the more we keep them focused on that and not on what is going on structurally in this country. How many of you find these theories appealing? I'm surprised. Well, people say, no, not conflict theory. Let's take a look at why, over to the PowerPoint, please. Let's take a look at why conflict theories are really necessary for use in social work. To begin with, they help us understand conflict. They help us understand inequality between people, inequality between ideas. Some ideas are just seen as being more worthy than others, yes? It helps us understand conflicts between groups, between social classes, communities, and also the larger social structures. That's very important because social work is a profession of change. We want to help create change for individuals, for families, for groups, for communities, and for the world. Another advantage of using conflict theories, very importantly, this is what systems theories leave out. Systems theories do not analyze the social structures. They pay no attention to the social structures. They pay no attention to power disparities. And folks, when you're working with clients, power disparities is a very important part of your assessment. If we were left using nothing but systems theory, we would have no way of taking a look at who has the power and who doesn't, and the effects that has on people's lives. Conflict theories are also useful, very importantly, in assessments. If oppression exists, we need to be able to see it. And unless we use this as at least a lens by which we can view people, we're not going to see oppression. We're not going to see their own reality. It also helps us do good assessments about client vulnerability. When people are downtrodden, when people are given few, if any, opportunities, be they educational or work or any other opportunities, opportunities for housing, fair housing, decent housing, we need to be able to address that. And systems theory just does not steer us in that direction. Very importantly, conflict theories, while we rarely use them with individuals, we do use them when we take a look at social policies. They are used to inform both social policies and what I call macro-level practice. What is macro-level practice? Away from the PowerPoint now. What is macro-level practice?
The big picture, society, organizations.
Yeah, working within organizations. Working within organizations, working within communities. One of the initiatives that came out of the change in power is focus on community organizing, which has not been around since roughly the 1960s. And we're starting to look at how we can help communities organize. And we can't do that with the other theories. The other theories leave out that power dimension that leaves us powerless, in a sense. Comments, questions? How do you see yourself using conflict theories in the future? Do you see yourself using conflict theories? Quiet. Quiet, quiet. Yeah, Linda.
With oppressed populations.
Now, if we accept C. Wright Mills and Marx's formulations, the oppressed populations include, guess what? They include us. So when we talk about oppressed populations, it's very easy for us to look only at the poorest of the poor or those who have patently unfair policies under which they live. But I think, and here's where the ideological control comes in. If we are the worker bees, guess what? We are oppressed. In Marx's formulation, even the elite are oppressed, but in a different way. They are oppressed by their own thinking that the structure has to be the way it is. Does that make sense? Yeah. Tony.
I was going to say that you mentioned in the book that as social workers, like, are we a part of the repressive culture? Like, don't we depend on that repressive culture so that we can have a job to help?
Absolutely.
Lift up?
Thank you. I was hoping somebody would bring that up. One of the things that we fail to recognize is that part of our jobs as social workers part of that function is a social control function. We don't let people just function however they want and do whatever they want. And I think it's very important for us to be able to understand our role in that. And because many of us are going to be out working for agencies and organizations that are, in Marx's formulation, part of that oppressive structure. Other ideas about how you might use it? Are we out of ideas? Okay, that's going to be it for today. We still have